The hills are alive with the sound of
John's farts.
Since it's the first episode of the new season, I think it falls on to you first.
Everyone's been waiting for.
Filthy.
Sorry, what? No, wrong video. Ah, quick! No! Hello! I'm Sister Alaska Lots.
And I'm Sister Babeushka.
And this is Utter Nunsense.
The show where we pour a boiling cup of tea
and utter whatever nonsense pops into our heads.
And this is basically, if you haven't guessed by now, a laid-back chat amongst good friends here.
And a new episode is uploaded once a month, every month, on the first of the month. So make sure you like and subscribe and hit the bell notification so you get notified of our new episodes.
And it's also available as a podcast. So please also subscribe and leave a comment on wherever you get your podcasts.
Also, because we never mention it, we do have a Patreon. And you know, stuff gets uploaded there, which is like behind the scenes, extra takes. There is a whole like 2 and a bit hours of me doing my makeup. So if you want to see that, you should go check out our Patreon.
All those delicious behind the scenes that you can't get at Only Nuns, join our Patreon instead.
We should be telling people what is happening with these nuns.
Dun dun dun.
What's today about?
Well, today we decided, since it is LGBTQ plus History Month, at least in the UK, and so we're going to talk about some history.
We thought to celebrate this month, we are going to share some of our fun, fabulous stories about LGBT history and hopefully learning from each other and learning some new bits of history, the bits that you didn't get taught in school. So these are going to be all the fun, juicy bits. And I don't know about you, I have some cracking stories. I'm so excited about this one.
See, I mainly picked up a few people from history rather than... But there are stories in there.
Because they're interesting people, there are a lot of interesting stories. Right. Let's get into some queer history stories. I'm so excited. I fucking love history. Who do we want to go first?
I mean, you fucking love history. Let you go first.
Amazing. Okay. I'm going to kick us off with a story about a lady called Julie de Beaugency from France. And I'm going to describe her as a 17th century bisexual badass.
Nice.
Have I piqued your interest yet?
No peaked.
She led a massively flamboyant lifestyle, and during her lifetime she was the subject of much gossip, rumor, and a multitude of colorful stories because she just did so many amazing things, all of which were quite risque at the time. She was not one to be pigeonholed. She was going to live her life as she wanted and fuck your gender expectations.
I like that attitude.
She just sounds absolutely amazing. She seems to have been super talented and she has a number of claims to fame, I suppose. So she was a celebrated opera singer. So she was very much in the public eye. Ooh. She was a skilled fencer.
Nice.
And she was an infamous seductress because she had many, many high-profile affairs with both men and women.
Oh, what a scandal.
Honestly, she sounds like my kind of lady. I love her. It's very difficult to pick which stories to bring as well because there's so many. One of the claims to fame that she has is that she was a nun.
Oh, it's like we're sisters with her already.
Right? But it's how she became a nun that's really interesting. You see, in amongst all of the love affairs that she had, there was one lover who was a young girl and the parents did not approve. And so they did what most parents would do back in the day to separate young lovers that they disapprove of. They sent their daughter to a nunnery. But of course, they weren't counting on the fact that unlike a male suitor, Julie was perfectly capable of following her girlfriend into the convent, which she did. I mean, talk about dedication. That's a love story. Someone should make this into a film. I would watch it.
I mean, that's a love story for the ages. Girlfriend said away, I will follow her to the nunnery and beyond.
So Julie did as she always did, decided no one's going to stand in her way. She's going to live her life. So she actually went as far as taking the vows and becoming a nun. So she didn't just like sneak in during a quiet Sunday or something. No. She actually became a nun in order to get herself into the convent, where of course she hooked up with her girlfriends. And it doesn't end there, because obviously they couldn't live their lives as they wanted in the nunnery. So they set fire to it in order to make their escape.
Oh my days. Oh
And they were
my,
out of there.
what a ruckus.
And this is just one of the many stories from her life. And all of them are this level of, oh my God, this is amazing.
I feel like they would be best friends to be with on a night out back in the day.
In a way, she was standing up for women's rights in general, just by not being told what to do and saying, no, I'm living life my way, and I'm going to call you out on your shit. So there are other stories that cover things like, there's one about her caning men's bottoms for harassing women in the workplace, her cross-dressing escapades, which happened more than once. And of course, as a skilled fencer, there's the life and death duels that she partook in, and of course won, because she was so absolutely badass.
That's amazing. Yeah, I love that. I love the fact that, yeah, she's very courageous, I think, to live her life as she wants to and say, fuck the system, you know, especially at a time where that is not maybe the done thing at all. So I think that's amazing. And yeah, the idea that she's just out there dueling life and death against the patriarchy sounds absolutely brilliant.
I think she ultimately became well known enough that there was a book based on her. So it wasn't like a retelling like for like of her life, but she was the inspiration for the character, and it's an incredible book as well. It's called Mademoiselle de Maupin, and it was written in 1835. So if you're interested in reading an even more fantastical account of this fantastical human being, that's definitely the book to go for.
Oh wow, yes, I definitely think I'll need to check that book out now.
History tends not to record the histories of women or queer people in the same way that they do, you know, privileged men in society. So that the more white, the more privileged you are, the richer you are, more powerful, etc., the more likely it is that you're going to end up in the history books. So to get so much of history on just this one woman is incredible. Can you imagine the stories that didn't make it into the history books? Because we only have a snippet of her life. There must have been so much more. I love her. I love her.
Is it too late to make her a saint of the house?
Oh, I love that idea. And of course, having spent some time in a nunnery in France, I'm sure she would have been well acquainted with nun farts as well.
So many farts in her mouth, no doubt.
We started with a bang, but I think that one bang is not enough. So we're going to go to Sister Babeushka for our next one.
Dun, 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 dun. I am going to take us over to Rome, one of the emperors. So I am going to talk about Emperor Elagabalus. Now, they were known for the conspicuous sex scandals, the religious controversy, and the complete disregard for Roman traditions and sexual taboos. Raunchy motherfucker indeed. Some of their exploits, before we get onto the sexy stuff, was replacing the traditional head of the Roman pantheon, which was Jupiter, with the deity Elagabal, of whom he had been a high priest.
They all end up in the nunnery eventually.
And also his marriage exploits were quite interesting, as he was married 5 different times.
I've just spotted a little quote about him online that says that he abandoned himself to the grossest pleasures with ungoverned fury. There's a quote if ever there was one.
Well, I think he might have been quite the lover, because although he married his first wife, and that went along fine. They were divorced within a year, and he'd actually managed to seduce his second wife, Aquilia, who was a Vestal virgin.
And
Mhm.
did they both survive that? Because back in the day, if there was any relations with a Vestal Virgin, there is punishment for both the Vestal Virgin and the person that they were with, usually which involved death. So
Wife number 2, and he's got to be married at least 5 times, so he survived it. I will highlight at this point, he's just a teenager.
I can totally understand then how the Vestal Virgin thing happened, just raging hormones.
His third wife, Ania, she was married to him after he'd recently had her other husband executed.
Did he just look at the wife and think, I fancy a bit of that, but I'm going to need to off him first?
I don't share my toys. I must have her to myself. Execution.
Even Henry VIII didn't execute the husbands of the women that he married.
In the last year of his reign, before his assassination, which I'll tell you about later on, because that is also so scandalous, he actually got back together with his second wife, Aquila, the Vestal Virgin.
Obviously, you can't keep them apart when it's true love.
But also, he had a husband named Heracles, and he was an ex-slave and chariot driver.
He married an ex-slave.
He actually took on a more feminine role in their relationship and sort of donned feminine clothing, feminine attributes as well. So much so that at some points he would even be going to sort of council meetings in more feminine attire and feminine fashion at the time.
What was the reaction? Did you find anything about? Oh,
yes.
We're coming to that, aren't we? Oh my!
We will get onto that. I just wanted to cover the sexy stuff before we get to the moida.
Given how they reacted to an emperor having relations with his horse, like Caligula. Yes, I can't imagine having relations with an ex-slave horse driver would be much better.
Not only that, but in the spare time, Elagabalus might actually also be found prostituting himself in taverns and brothels.
Why prostituting though? Like, no offense to him, like you got to get that coin somehow, but I wouldn't imagine as emperor he would need it,
Maybe there was a recession on in the Roman Empire at that time.
The original accountant.
There are some claims that at times Elagabalus would actually offer vast sums to any physician who could provide him with a vagina. And that is sometimes why he is seen as maybe one of the early transgender figures.
What happened to him?
Obviously, his behavior wasn't taken very well. That behavior started to estrange the Praetorian Guard, the Senate, as well as the common peoples. And so at 18 years old, he was assassinated and replaced by his cousin, Severus Alexander. The interesting part about this all is that the assassination plot against him was actually devised by his own grandmother and carried out by the Praetorian Guard.
Oh.
And it wasn't just himself, it was his mother was with him at the time, and so she was also assassinated with him. And his associates and his husband, especially Heracles, they were also disposed of.
I mean, these days, when a royal is sexually promiscuous in the wrong way, we just take their titles off them, apparently. That's all we do. Their ideas of gender and sexuality were also very different to ours. You can't make a direct comparison, but I've now just realised, should I be questioning what pronouns I'm using? I don't know. They wouldn't have known either.
That's the thing. I've stuck with he, him pronouns just because that seems to be with a lot of the records and is noted as emperor. But yeah, I suppose we wouldn't really know the preference of pronouns. I'm like, being a teenager is hard enough at the best of times, let alone with all that expectation and power on you as well.
I don't know if I can top that. Oh. I have a story about Pharaoh of ancient Egypt. This king was a mask-presenting woman. Generally, in ancient Egyptian society, women actually enjoyed a relatively high status, and they had things like decent legal rights. For example, they were allowed to own property, which many, many women throughout history in other parts of the world just weren't. However, female rulers were not the norm.
One of a few female rulers of Egypt. I'm like, yes, nice.
It was around about 1503 BCE that she did become the second woman to rule Egypt. And when she ascended to the throne, she chose to take the title of king, not queen.
Nice.
She was actually a fantastic king. She successfully managed to re-establish trade networks that had previously been destroyed by other pharaohs. She oversaw peaceful foreign expeditions. She oversaw peaceful foreign expedition. No, I can't say that word. She oversaw peaceful foreign expeditions. And she was one of the most prolific builders ancient Egypt has ever known. So much so that later pharaohs even tried to claim some of her projects as their own.
The dirty bastards, how dare they?
That looks good, I'm just going to say it's mine. Not that a man would ever take credit for a woman's work.
No, they never do that in history.
Some of the things that were interesting about her kingship was that she chose to assume the regalia and symbols traditionally associated with kings, which included wearing male clothing and wearing a false beard. And you can see this in like statues and depictions of her and stuff, that she has, you know, this male appearance, even though she continued to use feminine pronouns throughout.
Nice.
There was one particular tradition which is interesting, where pharaohs would have statues created of themselves, depicting them as the god Osiris, and she simply followed suit, and that includes the male body. So these depictions of her as Osiris don't use her body, they actually use the male god's body.
Ah, that's really interesting.
Isn't it?
I mean, if you're Pharaoh, you make the rules. You can do what you want.
And so, despite the fact that there were later attempts to try and hide her legacy from history, so people did ultimately try and smash some of her statues. They tried to score out her names in inscriptions, but her legacy still survives to this day because she was just such an epic king.
The fact that there were so many good deeds that were attributed to her, but yet still, because she wasn't the gender they want, that they still go out of their way to try and hide that from history.
Yeah, I mean, there were certainly other pharaohs that, you know, received similar treatment after death, where their name would be scored out or their face would be scratched off from carvings and things. So she certainly wasn't the only one to suffer that. But usually that kind of treatment comes along because they were a terrible king. And people were really, you know, unhappy with their policies and unhappy with the way they'd ruled. So it's interesting when it happens to a ruler who actually, by all accounts, seems to be very successful, and people enjoyed living under her reign.
For Ra's sake, come on.
I'm glad that they failed in their attempts and that she has survived in name to this day.
Because yeah, otherwise it just becomes a long line of males who, some did well, but some seem to do quite shit. So it's nice to see that give women the power for a change and watch something good happen. I
think one of my favourite pharaohs, just from an interest point of view, is probably Akhenaten, because he was so contentious. He tried to change everything. People were not happy with him. One of the things he tried to do was change the entire religious structure, because it was polytheistic, and he tried to change it so it was monotheistic. And the ancient Egyptians were not up for that. No.
I can't imagine that being allowed whatsoever.
He was not well liked, and they definitely tried to scrub him from history too.
It's just so interesting that you think you can scrub something that was so public knowledge from history.
It's really interesting seeing how outrage has been demonstrated throughout history. So you've got things like destroying statues and scrubbing people's names out, scrubbing out their face. And you can probably imagine that kind of thing happening today. It does happen today with, statues from colonial era, where it's, the person was a slave owner, etc., etc. Those statues being pulled down. Those kind of things have happened for centuries and centuries. We just have to hope that people's stories still come through, particularly when it comes to folk like trans people today. With the outrage that you get from some sections of society, I do hope that they don't try to erase the history of the conversations that are happening now, because they're important conversations and they need to be heard.
Definitely. The more you know.
All right. What's the next story then? What do you have for us, Sister Babeushka?
We're going west all the
Oh.
way over to America. Dun, 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 dun. I am going to discuss Weewa, who was a Zuni Native American from New Mexico and was notable as a fiber artist, weaver, and potter.
Okay.
Now, I'm going to butcher some pronunciations. Please forgive me because I am a terrible white person who can't learn any language other than English. They were the most famous Ilhamana on record, which in traditional Zuni culture, the Ilhamana are male-bodied people who take on the social and ceremonial roles usually performed by women.
Oh, very interesting.
And as part of that role, they will wear a mixture of women and men's clothing. And much of their work is usually in areas occupied by Zuni women.
Oh, so they've performed quite an interesting role in society then.
Some contemporary Ilhamana participate in the modern indigenous two-spirit community.
But it's
Definitely.
really lovely to see that there are different concepts of gender and gender expression and how that plays a role in society. The word two-spirit is something that people are more familiar with these days. But I believe there's other concepts and other terms. So it's not the only one, it's just one of a myriad in indigenous communities. And it doesn't map exactly to the word trans.
There's a lot of nuances.
It's well worth kind of looking up indigenous creators and listening to them talk about it.
People that are more familiar in their own culture would be able to answer than this white pale nun.
Because they have far more knowledge.
What would happen is Zuni children could be recognized as Ilhamana from early as 3 or 4. However, for Weewa, they were first included in religious ceremony for Zuni boys at the age of 12. And it wasn't until a few years after this that the tribe recognized their Ilhamana traits, and their religious training was then handed over to the female relatives.
How beautiful. I love it.
They actually served as a cultural ambassador for Native Americans in general, and the Zuni in particular. And they actually served as a point of contact and educator for many European American settlers, teachers, soldiers, and missionaries. Weewa's parents died quite early on in their life due to smallpox being introduced. That brutal side of colonialism where unfortunately indigenous cultures suffer with the introduction of new diseases that they've not had the chance to build any immunity to.
Fucking colonizers.
And it was while the missionaries were coming along to Zuni tribes, Weewa was referenced as he in the census, and he had to be a man because obviously they couldn't be accepted as Ilhana.
At the time that the Americas were being colonized, you were expected to dress in such a way that it clearly showed your gender and your social status as well. So the way that you presented yourself was really important based on your position in society. Obviously, as they're trying to assimilate other cultures, they're then imposing these kind of things on the indigenous people, which is just horrific. But there's a really interesting story about a colonizer who also fell foul of these rules. The evidence comes from a court case from 1629, where the Virginia court debated the gender identity of a servant called Hall, because at times Hall dressed as a man and sometimes as a woman. So Hall was just completely flouting the rules. And it ended up before the courts. This is thought to be the first record of gender ambiguity among the colonists themselves. Hall had been raised as female, but was actually intersex.
Oh, wow.
And after refusing to choose a gender before the court ultimately ruled that they were both a man and a woman. Ultimately, they were told that they had to help other people not be confused by wearing articles of both male and female clothing at the same time every single day. So ultimately, they were allowed to be both, and it was court decreed.
You must wear half a skirt and half a pant leg.
Okay.
That's brilliant. It's just, I can't imagine winning that at that time in history, but that's great.
Yeah. Anyway, so that was my little side note about colonialism and gender.
Good to hear a very successful story for that person. So I'm glad they won that.
Me too.
Yeah. So to wrap up on Weewa, So their friends and relatives would use both male and female pronouns. Wewa's friendship with the anthropologist, Matilda Coke Stevenson, would lead to a lot of material being published about the Zuni and their sort of culture and their traditions. Later on, Stevenson actually clarified that during her writings, she would use both male and female pronouns. And eventually, as time passed from her friendship with Wewa, she would actually only refer to Wewa with female pronouns. And that was because as a writer, she could never think of her faithful and devoted friend in any other light. And she will continue to use the feminine gender when referring to her.
That's really lovely to hear that, you know, despite the powers that be attempting to suppress who they were, that ultimately they continued to live their life by their own rules, and that the people around them, like the people who cared, their loved ones, their family, still saw their authentic self and, you know, referred to them as such.
I mean, I could have also mentioned that they were arrested for witchcraft at some point, but let's end on the happy note.
A remarkably interesting individual who must be Googled. I want to talk about how gay the Greeks are. I'm going to specify this is ancient Greeks that I'm talking about. I don't know how gay the current Greeks are.
95%.
Let's start with, have you ever seen Greek pottery, ancient Greek pottery? And have you seen how gay ancient Greek pottery is?
Not just the pottery, but if you've ever seen like the statue of, I can't remember his name, but taking down the Minotaur, and he is like straddling the Minotaur.
When I was studying classics at university, there were some very interesting books on that syllabus.
The Greeks were hella gay.
Homosexuality was actually really widespread in their society, but they didn't define sexuality in the same way that we do today. Instead of it being based on your gender, it was actually based on the role that you played. So whether you had a dominant role in the relationship or a submissive role. So basically like whether you're a top or a bottom.
It always boils down to that, doesn't it? At the end of the day on Grindr.
And there were a variety of different forms that these same-sex relationships could take, but one of the most significant ones, at least amongst the elite circles, was between adult men and adolescent boys. And the reason for that was that adult men were seen to be more masculine and higher status because they were, you know, they were full adult, whereas the younger ones, the adolescents, were seen to be more feminine and lower status because of their youth. Depicted a lot in their arts and in their literature, and it's in history books. It's a really common thing.
That is amazing.
And it was kind of like almost like a mentorship in a way, that's, you know, the younger of the pair would be learning from the elder in a variety of different ways. And before anyone asks, yes, there was a socially recognised minimum age requirement. So it's just to put that out there. Interestingly, what was taboo was a same-sex relationship between two men of equal age and status. So switches, no. You can only be top or bottom.
Oh my days.
But there's one particularly fascinating example, which I really love, which is a band of soldiers called the Sacred Band of Thebes. They were an elite force. They defeated a Spartan army, and Spartans are quite renowned for being like the pinnacle of soldier prowess. They went undefeated for 30 years. Like these guys were amazing. And to top it all off, it consisted entirely of gay men.
Nice. The best warriors in the world at that time, gay men.
Absolutely. And this it wasn't by accident. Nope. They were specifically chosen. It was 150 pairs of gay men in these relationships with the older and the younger. And their existence is generally accepted as fact by historians because there are so many historical texts that give really detailed accounts. And some of the things that they talk about are, for example, how the army of lovers, as I like to call them, they would fight side by side. Because the idea was that, you know, they worked really well together as a unit in every sense.
That makes perfect sense.
They knew they could rely on each other. It's like the perfect fighting team.
I mean, who else are you going to trust to have the sword at your back and protect you other than, you know, somebody that you're that intimate with?
Apparently, they would even exchange sacred vows to cement their obligations to one another as a couple as well. It certainly gives a new meaning to "till death do we part."
But now I'm questioning, where in the US military is this gay warrior unit?
Clearly, they're missing out.
I think I'm going to take us on a side tangent because I do want to touch on
Yes.
gay Greek culture. And I'm actually going to talk a bit more about, as you mentioned, obviously it was seen much more as a dominant, submissive, you know, mentor, tutor sort of role. But I've actually got one where the relationship actually carried on from youthful friendship into their adult life. And that is between Alexander the Great and his childhood friend, his general, and his bodyguard, Hephaestion.
So what you're trying to tell us then is that Alexander the Great was actually Alexander the Gay.
That is what I'm saying. It's more common to have that age difference, but these two, they were around the same age, and that carried on up until Hephaestion died, which then some people suspect was actually the cause of Alexander's death, because he flung himself on the body of his friend and lay there nearly all day in tears. He also had an elaborate funeral for him, and then he would be very despondent for the rest of his life and actually drink himself into a stupor with wine, and his health declined.
There seem to be lots of mixed accounts about Alexander the Great's sexuality, as far as I can remember. So I remember coming across some accounts where they said that his mother was so worried at his lack of sexual activity that she thought basically she was never going to get any grandkids. And she was very upset about this. But then there are other sources that say he was the opposite, that he was so overly sexually active with women throughout his life that he would bring like a different one to bed every night. It's like, and then you get all the stories in between. But of course, a lot of these accounts miss out the fact that he did actually have this really great love in his life, and it was not a woman. How heartbroken he was when they were gone just shows how deeply he felt that loss, and how really, I think that probably was his true love, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I think it touches again on, you know, when you were talking about that band of warriors, the fact that you've got your general and your bodyguard who is also, you know, you're going to spend a lot of time together. You know, relationships can form from that close proximity.
So yes, for anyone who didn't know, the Greeks are hella gay.
So gay.
I think we have had some really exciting stories today. They've been brilliant. How interesting. And each one of them has been so different.
You don't get taught in school, but if you do your digging, you can find these really cool stories of really radical females that say fuck the patriarchy time and time again to people that, you know, are just living their authentic lives.
Hopefully we've not given people like the obvious names that you've heard of, that these are maybe you've learned something new and you've got some new people to investigate and find out more about. They are definitely worth it. The stories about these people, we've not even covered the half of it.
It's been absolutely brilliant. Yeah. So go out, do more research, learn more queer things.
And fuck Section 28.
Fuck it so hard. Fuck every fucking law in the world. It's like Section 28. Fuck you all.
This kind of history should be taught alongside everything else. The history of oppressed people should be taught. We don't just want to hear about the rich white men. Sorry, not sorry.
Rich white men, boring and stale as fuck. Please move out of the way. I want the interesting bits of history.
I want the bisexual badass.
I want those gay pirates.
To hear about the gay pirates, you will have to come to my TikTok. I have saved them for then, in amongst a variety of other stories. I have 28 fascinating bits of queer history, which I'm going to be doing each day throughout LGBT plus History Month on my TikTok. So if you want to hear more, you should definitely come and watch.
But as well as covering everything LGBTQ plus history, I suppose we have to let you know what's happening next time as well.
And by that point, we'll be well and truly into season 2.
Yes. And what better way than for next time to try and replicate each other's makeup.
Very exciting. We've actually not decided whose makeup we're doing. But so the idea here is that we know people are really interested in the makeup that sisters do. So we want to do some more videos that cover that. And one of the ways that we're going to do this is by having one of us teach the other how to do their makeup and vice versa. Obviously, we're not going to manage both of our makeups in the same video. So this is going to be multiple videos where this will happen. But yes, so next month we are going to be having one person teaching makeup and the other person trying to learn how to do it their way, because everyone has their own style.
So you'll have to join in next time to see which unlucky person has to follow the other.
Please make it easy, whoever's doing it.
If you've liked this video and you found it educational, please like and comment below. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and ring the bell. Ding-a-ling-a-ling.
If you have not discovered our podcast yet, you should go and check out the podcast version of this. So you don't have to watch us. You can just listen to us in the background. We have all of the episodes up there as well. Please do check us out. It's available on your regular podcast provider. We're on loads of places. I think the only thing that's left to say is that we did the thing.
We did the thing.
We did the thing.
We did the thing.
We did the thing. We did the thing. We did the thing. We did the thing. We did the thing. Till next time.
Bye, fuckers.